What if I told you that the sinking of the Titanic was not a tragedy born of chance, but a calculated financial execution? Imagine for a second, the three most powerful men in the world, capable of stopping the creation of the greatest banking system in history, board a ship that, according to many, was doomed from the blueprints. A journey of no return, an economic coup d'etat, and a central bank born on a graveyard of ice. I am John Crime. Welcome. Today we are going to separate the official history from the hidden reality in a theory that, if true, would change everything we know about money, power, and death. To understand this conspiracy, we must travel to the years prior to 1913. At that time, the United States did not have a central bank. Monetary policy was in the hands of a select group of private bankers and families of immense wealth who, far from being allies, were in a state of constant financial war. At the epicenter of this chessboard were three figures representing the old guard of American industrial wealth. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship and possibly the world, Benjamin Guggenheim, mining and smelting magnate, and Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department stores. These three men not only had incalculable capital but political influence that gave them the power to block any legislation that did not favor their interests. And their primary interest was simple. They were frontally opposed to the creation of a centralized Federal Reserve. They understood that a central bank, even if called federal, would end up being a vehicle for a closed group of private bankers, led by J.P. Morgan, to take total control over the economy and the issuance of money in the United States. If the Federal Reserve were approved, Morgan and his partners would gain almost divine power over the financial system. If these three giants opposed it, the project would die in Congress. Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus were not just passengers. They were the living obstacles preventing J.P. Morgan from becoming the owner of American monetary policy. The question you must ask yourselves as we go through this account is the following. Is it really a coincidence that the three most influential men who could stop the Federal Reserve were, precisely on the same day and in the same place, on a ship designed to sink? For a plan of this magnitude to succeed, the architect needs to be far from the scene of the crime. This is where the figure of John Pierpont Morgan becomes central and, in the eyes of theorists, deeply suspicious. Morgan was not just any passenger. He was the majority owner of the International Mercantile Marine, the parent company that controlled the White Star Line, the shipping company responsible for the construction and operation of the Titanic. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton to New York. J.P. Morgan had a passage booked in the luxury suite to make the maiden voyage. However, at the last minute, he cited health problems to cancel his boarding. What is unsettling to independent investigators is that, just a few days later, Morgan was photographed walking calmly through a spa in France. A man sick enough to not take a pleasure trip, but healthy enough to enjoy French spas? For many, this was not a coincidence, but a perfectly executed alibi. But Morgan's shadow does not end with his absence. The theory suggests that the Titanic was not just a ship, but a weapon designed with critical deficiencies. Let us analyze the anomalies that, according to critics, were deliberate. The ship had barely 20 lifeboats, enough for less than half the people on board, even though the original design allowed for a much greater capacity. It is argued that this was a calculated decision to maximize the mortality rate of the targets on board. Captain Edward Smith, a man of vast experience, received direct orders to maintain an unusually high speed, despite receiving constant warnings about the presence of icebergs on the route. Why would a veteran captain ignore the most basic safety protocols if not under relentless external pressure? It has been theorized that the Titanic's distress flares were replaced with signals that were not visible at a long distance, ensuring that no other nearby ship could come to the rescue effectively before the sinking was irreversible. The ship's construction is also subject to scrutiny. The exchange theory is often mentioned. The Olympic, a sister ship to the Titanic, had suffered severe structural damage months earlier in a collision. Some investigators suggest that the company carried out an identity swap to send the Olympic, renamed as Titanic, to disaster, thus collecting a multi-million-dollar insurance while disposing of a defective asset and eliminating their financial rivals in the same act. In this block, we see how absolute power can distort reality. J.P. Morgan not only owned the ship, he owned the narrative of its construction and control over safety decisions. If the sinking was, in effect, a cleanup operation, it was executed with the precision of a banker who knows he cannot afford errors in his investments. The intrigue only increases when observing the calendar. Just 19 months after the Titanic sank, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. If the disappearance of John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus was the missing piece in J.P. Morgan's financial puzzle, time is the most incriminating witness. The conspiracy theory we are dissecting is based not only on suspicions about the shipwreck, but on the almost perfect chronology that followed the tragedy. Remember that, before the Titanic, the attempt to centralize the American banking system faced fierce resistance from these magnates, who saw in the Federal Reserve a loss of national sovereignty in favor of an international banking elite. Their death in the North Atlantic, on April 15, 1912, left a power vacuum that was quickly exploited by the proponents of financial centralization. The silence of the opponents. With the disappearance of the three magnates, the most influential voices with the greatest lobbying capacity against the banking project were permanently silenced. Political acceleration. Just a few months after the tragedy, the political climate in Washington changed drastically. Without the resources and opposition of these men to fund campaigns against the legislation, the path to the Federal Reserve was cleared of critical obstacles. The signing of the law. On December 23, 1913, little more than a year and a half after the sinking, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. This event marked a before and after in world economic history, granting a system of private banks the power to manage the monetary policy of the United States. For theorists, this coincidence is simply impossible to ignore. They maintain that the Titanic was not just a ship, but the vehicle for a political and financial cleanup necessary to consolidate the new economic order. It is argued that the bankers knew that, with these three men alive, the Federal Reserve Project would never have seen the light of day, since their ability to influence public opinion in Congress would have been enough to stop any attempt at banking centralization. This block forces us to face an uncomfortable reality. In the world of high finance, chance is rarely a factor that dictates major structural changes. The disappearance of the opposition, followed immediately by the legislative success of Morgan and his allies, is, for many analysts of historical true crime, the smoking gun of this case. We are reaching the heart of the analysis. We have seen the power, the architect, and the execution. Now, we must look at the evidence against it and the reality of the facts. To maintain the objectivity that a serious dissection demands, we must separate myth from historical data. While the theory that the Titanic was an instrument to establish the Federal Reserve is captivating and fits perfectly into the narrative of the great architect, forensic and economic reality presents contradictions that we cannot ignore. The magnate's stance on the central bank. While it is true that Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss were powerful figures, there is no solid historical evidence placing them as leaders of an organized political crusade against the Federal Reserve. The complexity of the legislation. The Federal Reserve Act was the result of years of intense debates, political negotiations between Democrats and Republicans, and pressure from agrarian and business groups seeking stability after the banking panics of the late 19th century. Reducing this complex legislative process to a simple murder on board is an extreme simplification of American politics in the early 20th century. The state of the Titanic. The exchange theory between the Olympic and the Titanic has been widely discredited by maritime investigators. The structural differences and the serial numbers on the parts found in the wreck confirm that the sunken ship was, undoubtedly, the Titanic. The management of the shipping company. The deficiencies in the lifeboats, although criminal from our modern perspective, aligned with the 1894 British Board of Trade Regulations, which were obsolete for ships of such size, but were not necessarily an assassination plan, but systemic bureaucratic negligence. Why, then, does this theory persist? The answer is psychological. Humans tend to seek patterns and rational explanations for traumatic events. An accident caused by a chain of human errors seems unfair and random, while a conspiracy, even if dark, grants a sense of order to chaos. The idea that a small group of powerful men pulls the strings of history is a narrative that helps process the magnitude of disasters that, otherwise, would be purely accidental. This critical analysis does not seek to dismiss the cynicism we may have toward financial powers, but to highlight that, often, incompetence, corporate greed, and bureaucracy are causes as destructive, or more so, than any shadow plot. We have completed the analysis of the conspiracy from all its angles. Now, we are nearing the end of this journey to close the case and reflect on what we have really learned. We have dissected the Titanic and Federal Reserve theory layer by layer, from the power board where the most influential magnates of the era moved, to the shadow of a J.P. Morgan whose absence from the shipwreck continues to arouse suspicion. We have analyzed the technical anomalies that fuel the myth of a ship designed to sink, and the almost poetic chronology of a financial system that was born, precisely, when its greatest opponents disappeared into the depths of the Atlantic. But, upon finishing this dissection, we face a truth more unsettling than any conspiracy theory. The financial system that emerged after 1913, regardless of whether it was born from a plot or political evolution, has shaped the lives of billions of people to this day. The story of the Titanic is ultimately a metaphor for our relationship with power. We prefer to believe in a complex conspiracy because it gives us hope that there is an order behind the chaos, that there is someone in charge, even if it is a villain, instead of accepting the terrifying possibility that the world often is simply a place where chance, corporate greed, and human negligence can cause an irreversible disaster. The Titanic case is the definitive reminder that power rarely moves in the light. Whether through politics, finance, or the control of information, decisions that change the course of history are usually made behind closed doors. If anything teaches us this dissection, it is that we must always question official versions, not because we should believe in all conspiracy theories, but because critical curiosity is the only defense we have against manipulation. History is not static, it is an incomplete puzzle, and each piece we dissect brings us a little closer to reality, however raw or insipid it may be. I am John Crime, and that has been all for today. If this dissection has changed your perspective on this historical event, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the blind spots of history and crime. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the bottom of the abyss. Until the next dissection.